they say, will solve challenges and problems no human can compete with. This efficiency and ready answers will make governing societies possible for far fewer human-centered laws and regulations. And as in the time of Judah's exile to Babylon, these destroyers of governments, cultures, and communities are among the most powerful, wealthiest, ruthlessly narcissistic of our time. Like the false prophets of Judah and the Babylonians, their religion is based on notions of the divine that are out of step with creation. Their God is wealth, power, and the technology that allows them to exercise their will with impunity. They are drunk with their own prowess. For Nebuchadnezzar, it was brute force, his conquering and carrying away of citizens of the surrounding communities through Babylon's military might that made him a madman. For the contemporary, it is AI and cryptocurrency. The quest to control democratic governments, remaking them into corporate monopolies, which make them a menacing force. Who are they? They are people like Peter Thiel, who does not believe democracy and freedom are compatible, Curtis Yarvin, who suggests there is need for a humane alternative to genocide of the poor. They are men who have been tutored in our finest universities, groomed by corporate and financial sectors, with enormous egos, undeveloped moral character, immature humanity, and virtually no spirituality. They are venture capitalists, AI engineers, and data programmers. They have funded and spearheaded the development of AI and digital currency over the course of the past few decades. They are mostly the Silicon Valley folks who live by the values of their unofficial mantra, move fast and break things. They worship money, they worship power, and they worship the science fiction of their own imaginations. They have poured billions of their private money into its development, to AI. But AI development has an insatiable appetite, driven by the cost of infrastructure, energy, and water resources. These multi-billion-dollar corporations are now focused on shifting those costs of development to the masses, you and I, through state tax incentives, shifting the cost for their energy production or usage, and their water usage also onto us. You've heard them boasting. AI, artificial intelligence, will soon outpace human intellect and ingenuity, rivaling our creative genius and rendering human intellect redundant, because AI has the potential to become a superintelligence. They are creators of the cult of AI. I'm not against technology, let me say that, be fair. But they believe AI will have the capacity to solve the problems which have confounded, and I'm thoroughly disillusioned by the ubiquitous and presumed expediency, the arguments for the inevitability of AI, not simply because I'm a boomer, and I am, proud boomer, and I am dinosauric sometimes. But the impact of AI actually threatens to first arrest cognitive development in our children, confuse fact with fiction for all of us, and flatten cultural diversity. In other words, it will make humans dumb again. The outcome is an unmaking of humanity and an unraveling of our willingness to be led by God's creative spirit. There are seminaries right now introducing AI into the work of putting together sermons. And the outcome is an unmaking of humanity and an unraveling our willingness to by God's creative spirit. Since the Enlightenment, Western philosophy and religion have agreed that what makes humans special is the ability to think, create, and to transcend the immediate and innovate. And I think, therefore, the statement, I think, therefore I am, is what we have for several centuries now believed what made us human, what made reality real for us. We were able to think and create and innovate and be inspired. Our theology has mirrored this philosophical claim in that we have understood humanity as created in the image of God. The ability to think, to transcend, and be co-creators with God. That's what made humans separate from plant life, from so-called animal life. There's questions about that. You know, we seem to be learning how much smarter and innovative and creative animals really are. And maybe our arrogance about our own abilities have made us blind to that. That is another way that God speaks, through the creation, through the world around us. But it is the oldest of human sinfulness that drives our shifting world right now. And that is greed, pride, and the desire for unfettered power. And that it drives our imaginations away from the alignment with God's will. This sin is what brought God's judgment on the southern kingdom. Judah, during the prophet Jeremiah's lifetime, had lost the ability to hear God's word, God's voice, God's truth. They replaced worship of Yahweh with cultic shrines and practices all across the kingdom. And Josiah, the prophets, did not accept the exile. Jeremiah is telling them that they must accept this as a part of God's purpose and will. And part of the reason why it was so hard for them to accept this as God's will, is that it seemed inconsistent for God to use an evil king, Nebuchadnezzar, to punish them. After all, they were God's people, right? But what they didn't understand and what they didn't take into consideration is that God's politics remain operative in the politics of nations. In other words, God's will and purposes are not thwarted by the politics of the nations around us, or even our own nation. God says, I alone know the plans I have for you. Plans to bring you prosperity and not disaster. Plans to bring about a future you hope for. Judah's exile was a result of Nebuchadnezzar's conquering and disposing of their king, their leaders, their government. But Jeremiah's prophecy to the exiles was that they should submit to this rule of history, because of the creative power of God was still at work, even in the midst of their judgment and punishment. Jeremiah called them to submit to the exile and to not resist, and that they were to remain faithful to who they were and to their God. In their exile, they were to build houses and settle down. They were to plant gardens and eat the good fruits and vegetables and the things that the earth bore for them. They were to marry and to have children, to let their children or help their children find spouses, and their children to have children. Their command was not to allow themselves to be diminished, but to instead increase. They were to build community. They were to work for the good of the cities where they were prisoners. And they were to pray to God on the behalf of those who had imprisoned them. Because if those who had imprisoned them and kept them captive were to prosper, they too would prosper. Wow. Wow. Even when you know that you are surrounded by evil, even when you know that those who are in charge of you don't know the God you know, don't worship the God you know, don't understand the voice of the God you hear, you are to pray for them. Wow. That was hard for me, because we grow up or we are formed and shaped in our faith traditions to see the world as the evil, right? And we're to resist the world, and we're to fight against the world, and we're to pull ourselves out of the world, separate ourselves. But this text is saying, build, plant, grow, increase, pray for, prosper. Wow. The genius of this text is that Jeremiah is teaching the exiles how to face the reality of their situation. The text raises the issue for me. And I struggled with this text. I have to be really honest. I didn't like it. That God would actually punish me for not praying for my enemies, not praying for the world that is trying to remake my world. This text raises the issue for me that what we are facing in our contemporary time is judgment of our own unfaithfulness. And I didn't like that. My job is to resist. That's what I do. I'm a leader. I'm a nonprofit leader, right? So, and we do justice work, environmental justice work. We see ourselves as coming alongside communities who have been disproportionately burdened by polluting industries, neglected from investment from the state and local governments, to support their resistance of those very same realities. I want to pray for them. So I really was convicted. So I was like, when's the last time I prayed for them? I couldn't remember. I struggle with this text because I didn't want to be caught on the side of those whose bad faith made it impossible for them to discern God's purposes in the exile. I didn't know whether I had to ask myself, am I being faithful in my work, in my existence, in my worldview? And as I studied the definition of false prophecy, I got a little bit more hope. I'm still convicted, and I'm still very cautious. But I recognize that one argument for determining the validity of a prophecy was according to Jeremiah, is looking back to see whether a prophet's message had come true. So in other words, today's message, y'all have to like put some dates on it and keep checking to see if what I'm saying comes true, right? So my fear was, I don't want to be numbered among the false prophets. But there is something wrong with what's going on in our world today. There is an injustice on the horizon that has not yet fully come to fruition, but all the telltale signs are there. And we have been maybe missing it because we've been focusing on resisting and fighting and anger. And some of it righteous anger. And have I prayed so that I can understand? Have we prayed so that we might have understanding, so that we might be clear that we're not siding with the false prophets? It's only through historical insight, or one of the ways is only through historical insight, that one can accurately determine prophetic falsehoods. And we haven't had enough time to fully determine what AI computing can and will accomplish. Yet, the motives can be judged. And I'm suggesting that the discourse about AI as a moral good for humanity is a false prophecy. There may be some good things that can be accomplished through it. I'm not suggesting that there's no benefit. But to wholeheartedly embrace without critique, without discernment, without listening and looking for God's voice is fearful to me. And I see our world moving in that direction. It is always a lie to put our faith in the creation of humans, in whatever humans create, in other words, no matter how ingenious it is. Particularly when that creation, when that development is said to be able to rival what I understand as a gift of God, the ability to think and be creative and innovative and inspired. That comes from the Spirit of God. I don't think we have intellect or intelligence without God's Spirit, even when we don't know God. So I see that as always a lie, always a false prophecy. Jeremiah teaches us another way to suss out truth, and at truth from lies about God, and that is whether what the prophet or the entity or the statement says and does is aligned with God's historical actions. Is it like God to want or to have us not use our God-given abilities for work? You know, AI promises to take away lots of work that maybe the common person needs to sustain their lives. It also, because of the push for